If this is opened tonight, nothing inside this family will remain where it was."
The remark was so quiet it might have been mistaken for prayer, had it not been followed by the sharp sound of crystal shattering against the edge of a silver tray. At the long table, beneath the low chandelier light, a champagne toast meant to soothe an uneasy evening had ended in a fractured spill and a room full of startled silence. What King Charles and Camilla had not prepared for was not merely disapproval, nor another private warning, but a statement already approved by William and Catherine that would define Camilla's future before she could defend it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The sealed envelope arrived less than an hour later, carried not by a footman but by the king's principal private secretary, which was how everyone in the room understood that this was no social correction and no passing displeasure. A memorandum was a formal written instruction because spoken objections could be denied, but written ones could be enforced. The envelope itself was thick, cream-colored, and pressed shut with black wax marked by the late Queen's cipher, and a cipher was her official royal mark because it turned private preference into recognizable sovereign authority. Charles saw it, removed his glasses, and for a moment did not move at all. His hand, which had been resting near the stem of an untouched glass, stopped with such complete stillness that even Camilla, who had spent years studying his smallest gestures, understood that something more dangerous than family disagreement had entered the room. No one spoke while he broke the seal. The room fell completely silent. Not performatively, not ceremonially. It was the kind of silence that begins in the throat and settles into the furniture. He read the first page once, then again. Then he folded it shut without finishing the final paragraph, as though the act of closing it might undo what had already been written in her own hand. Princess Anne, seated several feet away, did not ask what it said. That was the first unmistakable sign. She already knew. Charles lifted his eyes to her, and the silence was more painful than accusation. Anne answered before he could speak. It was placed in trust to be opened only if certain boundaries were crossed. Trust, in this case, did not mean affection. Trustees were people legally or institutionally chosen to carry out another person's wishes because memory alone was too weak a safeguard. William had known as well. Not every word, perhaps, but enough to understand why Anne had insisted upon a review, enough to agree that what had once seemed hypothetical had become unavoidable. Charles glanced toward the closed door, as if he knew his son's absence from the room was its own kind of declaration. Camilla did not yet ask for the paper. She only looked at the wax seal broken in two on the polished table, and that was when she understood the true insult. It had not come from courtiers. It had not come from newspapers. It had come from the dead and been carried by the living. But before Charles could decide whether to read the decree aloud, Camilla would first have to understand who had already decided her place in the next reign. She did not cry. She did not shout. When Charles finally handed the first page across, Camilla accepted it with both hands, read no more than half a paragraph, then reached to her collar and unclasped a sapphire brooch she had worn for years to private family dinners. She placed it beside the broken wax without a word. The gesture was so small it might have escaped a stranger, but everyone in that room knew what it meant. Symbols mattered there more than raised voices ever could. A brooch, in palace terms, was never just jewelry. It was a visible sign of belonging, memory, favor, and rank, because the family had long used adornment to say what it could not safely confess. Anne did not lower her gaze. For Anne, this was not simply about Camilla. It was about continuity, about the late Queen's invisible authority, about the belief, carved into her almost from birth, that the crown could not survive if personal comfort was allowed to blur constitutional lines inside the family itself. William, when he entered moments later, carried the expression of a man who had been walking toward an inevitable wound and had still hoped, foolishly, that the blow might miss him. He stood near the door at first, not beside his father and not beside Camilla. That hesitation said everything. Duty had called him into the room. Affection had prevented him from choosing a side. Catherine came in behind him and remained silent. She did not sit. She did not intrude. Yet somehow the gravity in the room seemed to orient itself around her restraint. She stepped close enough that only William could hear her whisper, and her counsel was almost unbearably gentle. "Do not answer the hurt first," she said. "Answer the damage. The words landed like a second decree. A decree was a command carrying sovereign force because it did not ask for agreement before changing reality. Camilla looked up then, and for the first time the wound beneath her composure showed plainly. Not because her title had changed, because trust had. She had endured public suspicion before. She had survived whispers, comparisons, cold headlines, rooms that went quiet when she entered. But this was different. Public cruelty could be met with private solidarity. What had arrived tonight suggested that solidarity itself had limits. Charles tried to speak in defense of her, yet every phrase broke apart under the weight of the document in his hand. Anne remained cold, but not cruel. William remained loyal, but not reassuring. Catherine alone seemed to see the human cost without pretending it erased the institutional one. The silence was more painful than any sharp remark, because silence left everyone alone with what they feared most. Camilla feared replacement. Charles feared judgment. William feared inheritance poisoned in advance, and Anne feared disorder disguised as kindness. Yet the greater shock lay in what waited behind the document itself, for before any of them could challenge the order, the family would first have to remember the private evening that had made such an order necessary. To understand why the late Queen had taken such an extraordinary step, the family would have to confront the Windsor incident, an evening spoken of so rarely that even among the inner household it had become more rumour than memory. It had happened at Windsor Castle in the final season before her health began to fail, on a damp autumn night when the corridors felt too wide and the fire in the smaller drawing room burned lower than usual. No aides had been summoned, no minutes had been taken. Only 4 people were present: the Queen, Charles, Camilla and Anne. That absence of witnesses mattered. A private audience was a confidential meeting with the sovereign, because some matters were considered too sensitive to leave any official record at all. The evening had begun with paperwork regarding future residence allocations, patronage visibility, and ceremonial precedence once Charles's reign settled into routine. Precedence meant the formal order of status because in royal life, where one stood, entered, or sat was never accidental. Camilla had been calm then, almost practical. She had asked for something that, outside palace walls, might have sounded harmless. A permanent voice in the management of access to certain private family apartments, including discretion over who could enter, when they could use adjoining rooms, and which staff routes would remain open during periods of mourning or transition. There had been a pause. The Queen had not answered immediately. She had lifted a sheet of paper, then set it back down. Charles, eager to smooth what he thought was a procedural wrinkle, said that such influence would prevent confusion and spare future embarrassment. Camilla had added one sentence more. Only one. If I am expected to protect the dignity of the crown in private, then private space must answer to me as well. The room fell completely silent. For the Queen, this was not simply about rooms. It was about thresholds, about the difference between being honoured within the institution and governing its internal inheritance. A custodian was someone entrusted to protect something on behalf of another, because ownership and guardianship were not the same thing. The late Queen had spent a lifetime preserving those distinctions. To her, Camilla's request sounded less like household order, and more like the first quiet claim upon the architecture of succession. William said nothing that night because he was not there, but Anne had seen the Queen's face change, not in anger, in conclusion. The Queen had then asked a single question, so evenly that it chilled the room more than outrage would have. Do you seek comfort in this family, or authority over its future? Before Camilla could answer, Charles had tried to intervene. He spoke about loyalty, companionship, the years already endured, but the late Queen had already withdrawn inward. She removed her glasses, folded them upon the side table, and announced that the matter would be reviewed under Controlled Access Protocol. Controlled Access Protocol meant formal restrictions on who could enter, supervise, or influence certain private royal spaces, because proximity itself could become power. Later that night, written in her own hand, she added a private instruction to be sealed and held in reserve if any future sovereign failed to distinguish household affection from dynastic control. Anne was named custodian. William was to be consulted. Catherine, though not named, would later understand the moral logic of it with painful clarity. Camilla had left Windsor believing the request had been deferred. She had not understood it had instead been remembered. But the document had not merely preserved an old grievance, it had preserved a trigger. And before Charles could protect the marriage he loved, he would first have to face what the Queen had written on the final page. By midnight, no courtiers remained, no officials stood ready, and the last footman had been dismissed from the corridor outside the king's study. Charles closed the door himself. Camilla stood at the mantel with one hand braced against the marble edge, not out of weakness but out of fury so tightly governed it had nowhere else to go. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The study, so often cluttered with dispatch boxes and briefing papers, felt stripped down to essentials. Husband, wife, sovereign, threat. "You should have told me there was something like this in reserve," Camilla said at last. Charles did not answer immediately. He had removed his glasses again, as he always did when trying to gain time against truth. "I knew there had been a note. I did not know the full extent." The words landed like a shut door. She turned then, and the hurt on her face was more devastating for being so controlled. "That is not the same as innocence." A letter of reserve was a private written instruction, meant to be used only if normal trust failed, because institutions prepare for rupture long before families admit it exists. Charles moved toward her, stopped halfway, and seemed suddenly unsure whether he had the right to cross the remaining distance. "I thought it had died with circumstance," he said. "I thought no one would ever invoke it." Camilla's reply was quiet. "And yet Anne did. There was accusation in it, but also disbelief. She did not shout. That made it worse." Charles tried to defend Anne, then stopped, because he could not. Anne had done precisely what the late Queen had asked. That was the torment of it. Duty, once written, becomes difficult to condemn without condemning the principle beneath it. And Charles, for all his anguish, was still sovereign enough to know that principle mattered. Then Camilla asked the question he had dreaded. "What exactly does it require?" He hesitated. That hesitation answered too much. She crossed to the desk, took up the remaining pages, and found what he had failed to finish. Midway through the document was an attached clause, initialed separately in faded ink. A clause was a distinct provision inside a larger order, because sometimes the most serious consequences are hidden in smaller sections no one expects to matter until too late. This one stated that if the sovereign's consort sought supervisory influence over residential allocation, memorial access, archive presentation, or the informal routing of heirs within royal households, such privileges were to be withdrawn from her future office and transferred under review to the line of succession. Camilla read it twice, then a third time. So this was never about one conversation at Windsor. "No," Charles said. "What then?" He finally answered with the honesty he had delayed for years. "It was about fear, hers, Anne's, perhaps even mine. The fear that the family's emotional compensations might one day be mistaken for constitutional rights." The room fell completely silent. Camilla looked at him as though seeing, not betrayal exactly, but the architecture of his weakness. He loved her. That had never been in doubt. But love had not made him brave enough to name the limits of what he could give. An archive, in royal life, was not merely a storage of papers. It was a controlled memory of the monarchy, because whoever shaped access to the past could quietly shape the legitimacy of the future. She understood now why the document referenced memorial access as well as apartments. This was about rooms, portraits, papers, thresholds, and narrative, about whether she might one day stand between the next sovereign and the symbolic inheritance meant to pass around her, not through her. Before Charles could ask for her understanding, she revealed the deeper hurt. "I could have borne denial," she said. "What I cannot bear is discovering I was measured against a danger you never had the courage to describe." Yet the greater shock lay in the next room, where the heir had been waiting with an unsigned paper of his own. And before the king could defend his silence any further, William would first have to decide whether to formalize the wound or stop it with his own hand. William stood alone in the adjoining room when Catherine found him, the unsigned paper open across a narrow writing table, its margins crowded with annotations from the private secretary and cross-references to the late Queen's sealed instruction. He had read it once downstairs, once again outside the study, and now a third time under the lamp, as if the words might rearrange themselves into mercy if only he looked long enough. They did not. Precedent was an earlier action treated as a guide, because monarchies survive by repeating limits as carefully as they repeat honors. He knew that. He hated that he knew it. Catherine closed the door behind her and did not come too near at first. Her stillness gave him space to remain unguarded for one breath longer than he otherwise could have managed. Then she asked the question that would define the night. "Are you deciding as a son or as an heir?" He lowered his head. The question was not sharp, but it left no room to hide. Succession was the formal passing of the crown, from one sovereign to the next, because the monarchy could not pause while emotions caught up. William looked again at the paper before him. One signature from him would confirm that certain residential privileges, access customs, memorial rolls, and future ceremonial expectations concerning Camilla were to be narrowed permanently, in preparation for the reign he would one day inherit. Refusal would not erase the late Queen's instruction, but it would delay enforcement and expose the family's divisions to even greater danger. "For my father, this is about loyalty," he said at last. "For Anne, it is about obedience. For Camilla, it is about humiliation. But for me," he stopped. Catherine waited. "For me, this is about whether I begin my own future by pretending lines do not exist." The silence was more painful than answer. Catherine stepped closer then, resting her fingers lightly on the back of the chair rather than on him, as if even comfort must respect the gravity of the decision. A constitutional review was a formal examination of whether practice still matched governing principle, because habits formed in one reign could become crises in the next. William knew that whatever he signed tonight would echo forward, long after the immediate wound faded from drawing-room memory. He picked up the document. Read the operative clause again, then once more from the beginning. Before he could answer even himself, he saw two versions of duty laid side by side. Protect his father's peace, or protect the structure his father had sworn to maintain. The crown could not survive if heirs inherited only sentiment and no limits. At last he took the pen, then stopped. The room fell completely silent. He set the pen down, and instead of signing, lifted the final page and tore cleanly across the lower half, severing the prepared signature block from the body of the order. Not to destroy the instruction, not to deny its force, but to refuse the appearance that he had endorsed its harshest reading without revision. "I will not sign humiliation," he said. "I will sign order." Catherine said nothing. Her silence was assent enough. William reached for a fresh sheet. He would mediate, not erase. He would recognize the late Queen's command, but recast its execution in language that protected succession without publicly breaking the woman who had stood beside his father. It was, in its own way, the most difficult path of all. But before revised order could soothe the damage, the household itself would first have to move, and only then would everyone see what a private decree looks like when it becomes physical fact. By morning, the consequences had begun in the only language palaces truly obeyed. Keys, lists, routes, inventories, access notes, amended seating plans, and staff instructions copied in discreet hands. A privilege inside royal households was never merely courtesy. It was a practical permission because power often revealed itself through who could enter, remain, direct, or delay. Camilla learned this before breakfast when a senior house steward, visibly shaken, requested the return of 2 interior access keys tied to a silk ribbon she kept in a lacquered tray near her dressing room mirror. She handed them over without protest. She did not cry. At Buckingham Palace, guest circulation plans were quietly rewritten so that private memorial display rooms would no longer be opened on informal request from the Queen Consort's office. At Windsor Castle, the book logging access to certain family apartments was updated, and one standing notation beside her household liaison was struck through in dark ink. At Sandringham, Christmas residential assignments were placed under future review rather than continuing by custom. At Balmoral, the long-tolerated courtesy allowing discretionary guest additions to late summer weekends was suspended pending sovereign approval. The cadence of those names carried weight of its own, as though the island itself were rearranging under administrative hands. Staff moved through suites with the careful neutrality of people who understood too much and wished to show none of it. An inventory was taken of personal items displayed in transitional family rooms rather than strictly private apartments. Framed photographs, signed notes, commemorative gifts, even a silver box once left on a side table near a staircase used by both household branches. Inventory meant an official count and record, because what had not been formally assigned could no longer be assumed to belong where affection had placed it. The words landed like a verdict each time they appeared on paper. More humiliating still was the bureaucratic detail of one reduced privilege. The controlled access protocol now required that any request from Camilla's office concerning shared memorial spaces, archive consultation, or family room scheduling be submitted 48 hours in advance through the Lord Chamberlain's office rather than arranged directly with resident staff. A protocol was a fixed procedure because institutions distrust improvisation most when feelings run highest. It was not dramatic. That was precisely why it hurt so much. Grandeur can survive scandal more easily than it can survive paperwork. No official announcement had yet been made, but the household already knew. Empty chairs at luncheon said so. Closed doors along familiar corridors said so. Even the folded napkin left untouched beside Camilla's plate seemed to speak. Not because her title had changed, because trust had. Charles watched the machinery turn and hated himself for recognizing that it was turning correctly. Anne reviewed the implementation notes without visible satisfaction. William insisted on softened language wherever possible. Catherine urged mercy in every margin. Yet mercy could not restore the old arrangement once written boundaries had been activated. And still, behind every practical enforcement lay a more intimate wound no inventory could capture. Before the household could settle into its new pattern, the wounded party would first have to request the one conversation no decree could command and no secretary could safely witness. But the order had not merely reduced access, it had exposed a private truth. And before the family could survive the public version of events, Camilla would first have to speak to Charles where no palace grandeur could shield either of them. She sent the request herself on a small cream card in an envelope without seal, asking Charles to meet her that evening at Clarence House. Not in the reception rooms, but in the modest private study, overlooking the garden, where the lamps were lower, the carpets older, and the furniture still carried traces of a life lived before crown and correction had swallowed every domestic comfort. A renunciation was a formal giving up of a claim, because there are moments when surrender changes meaning from defeat into authorship. Charles arrived without equerry, without secretary, without even the usual red box under his arm. No courtiers remained in the corridor. No official stood ready. It was not a state encounter. It was a marriage standing before its own limits. Camilla was already there. The room was plain by royal standards, almost intimate in its refusal of spectacle. A tray sat untouched between them. One lamp, one closed door, one unsigned page at first glance, though when Charles came closer he saw it was no longer unsigned at all. She had written on the final line already. "I asked you here," she said, "because palaces turn pain into theatre. I did not want this one performed." She did not cry. She did not shout. Instead, she unfolded a napkin she had been holding too neatly, placed it flat beside the paper, and then smoothed the corners with both hands as if calming cloth were the only possible substitute for calming history. Her composure was almost unbearable. Charles sat opposite and waited, which was perhaps the bravest thing he had done all day. "I was angry last night," she said. "I am still angry. Not because they drew a line, because you let me walk toward it without telling me it existed." The words landed like a bell in an empty chapel. Charles began to apologize, but she raised one hand and he stopped. Before he could answer, she continued in a lower voice. "I asked for influence where I should have asked for reassurance. That is the truth of it. And because I feared being permanently peripheral in a family built on memory, I reached for structures when what I wanted was belonging. Belonging was not an institutional term, yet inside that room it felt more dangerous than any constitutional phrase." Charles closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the hurt in his face was stripped of all kingly discipline. "I loved you badly in this matter," he said. "Not lightly. Badly." The room fell completely silent. On the table between them lay the paper she had signed. It was not a surrender to punishment. It was a recasting of the entire crisis. The document stated that she voluntarily accepted the narrowing of household supervisory privileges, renounced any future claim to discretionary influence over private residential allocation, memorial access, or archive presentation, and affirmed that the line of succession must remain institutionally distinct from the sovereign's marriage. Written in her own hand beneath the prepared text was an additional sentence no secretary had drafted. This acceptance is given not in disgrace, but in service to the peace of the family and the steadiness of the crown. Charles read it once, then again. An apology in palace life was rarely enough, but a signed acceptance transformed the meaning of the decree because it turned compulsion into chosen restraint. That distinction mattered. For Camilla, this was not simply about losing access. It was about preserving dignity in the very act of yielding. She looked at Charles and in the quietest voice of the night said, "If I remain at your side, it must not be as a question hanging over your son's future." He reached across the table then, not theatrically, not desperately, merely placing his hand over hers. For the first time since the envelope had been opened, the wound seemed survivable. Not healed, not absolved, survivable. Yet survival inside palace walls rarely remains private for long, and before their fragile peace could harden into settlement, the outside world would first have to receive the version of events the palace believed it could control. But the carefully chosen language of the statement had not merely informed the nation, it had invited interpretation, and before dusk fell, the gates themselves would become the stage on which private pain turned into public symbol. The release went out just after noon, brief, polished, and sterile, in the way only palace language can be when trying to conceal the heat of what it has survived. A statement, in this context, was a carefully worded public notice because institutions reveal only as much truth as they believe order can tolerate. It announced an internal reclarification of household roles, memorial stewardship, and future access protocols affirmed full mutual regard among senior members of the royal family, and noted that certain responsibilities will be more closely aligned with the direct line of succession in years ahead. The words were dry enough to sound administrative, which was why the broadcasters interrupted normal programming within minutes. Crowds gathered outside the gates by mid-afternoon, drawn less by understanding than by instinct. They sensed correctly that something within the household had shifted. Camera crews pointed through iron railings. Commentators repeated fragments of palace phrasing as if decoding scripture. One afternoon paper appeared with the headline, "The door closes on Camilla's inner palace power," and though no official confirmed the phrase, it spread because it felt true. The words landed like a public echo of what had already been settled in private. At the gates, among flowers not meant for mourning and phones raised high above impatient shoulders, an elderly woman in a navy coat placed a handwritten sign against the stone. The note was simple, almost clumsy, written in thick blue marker. "Love cannot rearrange the line." Broadcasters seized upon it at once. By evening, they were calling it the defining symbol of public reaction. A symbol mattered because crowds understand images faster than explanations, and one handwritten sentence can sometimes carry more force than a page of official language. Inside, Anne watched the coverage without visible pleasure. William watched without speaking. Catherine, seeing how quickly nuance had evaporated in public retelling, understood anew why she had urged restraint from the start. Charles turned the television off after less than a minute. Camilla did not ask him to turn it back on. The silence was more painful than commentary, for outside the gates, people thought they were watching a power struggle. Inside the houses, those who had lived it knew they were watching a marriage, a memory, and a succession being forcibly separated into parts that might endure. But before public reaction could settle into narrative, the four people most marked by the decree would first have to sit together one last time, without advisors, without staff, and without any remaining place to hide. Yet the greater shock lay not in what the public believed, but in what the king would finally admit when the doors were closed and the papers placed in the center of the table. The final meeting took place that night in a private room, stripped almost bare for the purpose, as if removing splendor might encourage honesty. Charles sat first. Anne entered second. William came in with Catherine's revised language folder, but left her outside, because this reckoning belonged to those who had signed, invoked, enforced, or endured. Camilla arrived last. No advisors, no officials, no courtiers remained. 4 chairs, 1 table. 1 torn signature block still tucked inside William's folder, like a relic of the choice he had refused to make in the harsher way. Charles began without preface. "I failed all 3 of you differently," he said, "and that is the truth. I should have spoken sooner." The room fell completely silent. He turned first to Anne. "You carried out what was asked. Thank you." The words were formal, but not cold. Gratitude here was not comfort. It was acknowledgement that someone had protected a boundary he himself had been too conflicted to hold. Then he faced Camilla. His voice changed, softer, more naked. "I am sorry, not for loving you, never for that. I am sorry for letting love become the excuse by which I delayed duty, and thereby deepened the injury duty would finally cause." Camilla listened without interruption. She did not cry. That restraint gave her more authority than any outburst could have offered. William then removed the torn signature strip from his folder, looked at it once, and placed it in the middle of the table. A sign-off was formal approval because institutions crave visible completion, but his gesture rejected the fiction that this outcome had been easy or clean. He had not signed humiliation. He had instead rewritten consequence into something the future could inherit without poison. "I will uphold the settlement," William said, "but I will not pretend this family was unhurt in making it." For William, this was not simply about Camilla's future. It was about the reign he would one day inherit, about whether firmness could be exercised without cruelty, about whether memory could discipline affection without destroying it. Anne inclined her head once, the nearest thing to tenderness she would permit herself in such a room. Camilla then spoke for the last time. "I accept the outcome." Nothing theatrical followed. No trembling hand, no plea for reconsideration. "I accept it because peace must now matter more than position." A settlement was a final agreed arrangement because endless ambiguity corrodes institutions faster than openly painful truth. Charles nodded, and in that small movement the entire ordeal seemed to settle from raw crisis into lasting scar. The family would never be the same after William and Catherine's shock statement on Camilla's future. Not because it had overthrown anyone, but because it had forced everyone to say aloud what had long been managed through silence. But before history could close over the wound, one final truth remained, and it was the only truth monarchy ever learns too late and survives only by remembering. Power could protect love, but it could not make every private wish legitimate. That was the lesson left on the table among torn paper, folded cloth, and the empty space where old assumptions had once sat so comfortably. The monarchy, as ever, would go on bruised but steadier. Charles had kept his marriage, but only by admitting its limits before the institution his son would inherit. Camilla had lost certain privileges, yet kept the one thing humiliation alone could not take from her: dignity freely chosen at the moment of surrender. Anne had guarded memory. William had guarded succession. Catherine had conscience. And somewhere over all of it, like a command still written in her own hand, remained the late Queen's final warning that affection could comfort the crown, but must never confuse its order. Love may stand beside the crown, but it cannot stand above it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.